For the keynote speech by Tristan Tarantino. Tristan is an award-winning writer, a sex educator, speaker, filmmaker, and radio host. She's the editor of 25 anthologies and author of 8 books, including The Ultimate Guide to Kink and the feminist porn book, The Politics of Producing Pleasure. As the head of Smart Ass Productions, she has directed and produced 24 sex educational and erotic films. She lectures to top colleges and universities and teaches sex and relationship workshops around the world. She has been in the BDSM scene for over 2 decades and taught KeyNote and taught and emceed for over 100 kink organization events around the world. She is the host of Sex Out Loud, a weekly radio show on the Voice America Network. So I'm really happy to introduce Tristan. She's a fellow New Yorker, former New Yorker. We came up for the past couple of decades together, so I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I want to begin today by having a moment of silence and purple for Prince. Thank you, Prince. I also want to remind you that I can't talk about consent without talking about sexual violence, so please take care of yourselves. Feel free to get up and walk out at any time. You are not hurting my feelings. In her plenary, Susan did an incredible job of laying out the past 2 decades and bringing us up to speed on public advocacy, legislation, campaigns, and grassroots organizing around consent. She reviewed some of these efforts with a critical eye toward what they may be reinforcing, and she highlighted both the progress and what we have yet to accomplish. I would like to dive into what we can do to take these very big ideas and efforts and bring them down to a micro level as individuals to create meaningful change as each of us moves through the world. And I also want to pick up where Susan left off and imagine a future of consent culture. But first I want to share my own education about consent and to locate myself within this landscape that we're all going to be talking about today throughout the summit. Maybe what I know about consent I learned on college campuses. First, that's not saying very much. Because the Association of American Universities studies found that 1 in 4 female undergraduates and 1 in 20 male undergraduates on college campuses are sexually violated in some way. So we heard stats earlier about rape. This statistic, I think, is even more startling and speaks to consent violation. And I just read a study this morning, a 2015 Planned Parenthood study that said that 22% of their respondents said engaging in foreplay is consent. And 35% said taking off your own clothes is consent. I actually talk to thousands of students every year because I do a lot of college lecturing, and my 2 big takeaways about sexual experiences on campus are 1, no one is talking, and 2, nearly everyone is drinking. And by the way, this actually isn't limited to college students. Jacqueline Freedman, who is the brilliant feminist activist and the co-editor of the groundbreaking anthology Yes Means Yes, was recently on my show, Sex Out Loud, and we talked about sexual assaults on campus, which she does a lot of work around. And I asked her what she says to students about alcohol and drugs, since on campus it's nearly always involved in sexual violations. I told her I felt preachy and, quite frankly, old when I told young people things like, if you have to have 6 beers to summon the courage to do it, then just don't do it. What am I, Nancy Reagan? But there's a deeper question lurking here. Why do we drink or get high in order to have sex? Because we live in a sex-negative world. Because expectations about how we're supposed to behave are already set up for us before we even get there. And they're shaped by society according to our gender, our sexual orientation, race, class, ability, and size. Because we're afraid, we're anxious, we're nervous, we're unsure, we're stymied by shame and guilt and misinformation or lack of information about what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. Plus, no one's taught us about consent. So we don't take the time to really see our partners. There are too many people who don't acknowledge the power inequalities that exist between them, or to really deeply care about the other person's experience. Part of why I think we rush ahead in sex is that we're trying to manage our own anxiety. We've come to internalize that anxiety as ours. There's something wrong with us because we're so nervous. But this anxiety about sex belongs to our culture. Fairy tales, abstinence-only sex ed, silence around talking about sex, moral judgments, fueling laws, policies, language, horror stigma, it's all set us up to fail. And we don't have very much role modeling that shows us that it's actually okay to be nervous, or that communication facilitates, not interrupts, not ruins, facilitates pleasure. We can be our awkward weirdo selves in sex. Yes and no sounds so simple, but that is just not always the way things work. I go back to Jacqueline Freedman, who says consent is not like a light switch. It can't be just either on or off. That's why I'm excited about how college students especially are sort of taking up these new consent campaigns that address things like that. I want to shout out to the organization Force, Upsetting Rape Culture. They are launching a video contest on Monday for people to make 30-second videos of people negotiating sex and consent. It's going to be a whole contest. Really good. Plus, our understanding of yes and no, our ability to speak it confidently, our ability to recognize violation in real time, our confidence in our own bodily autonomy is not black and white. And it's not happening in a vacuum. People feel and people are disempowered by very real constraints, like misogyny. And misogyny doesn't hang out alone. It intersects with racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, sizeism, and other oppressive systems. And so I actually disagree with a piece of Susan's presentation. I actually don't think that this problem has to be gender neutral. Because the truth is women, trans people, and non-binary people experience consent violations at much higher rates. I'm sure that some of you saw the video that went viral, and Susan mentioned it, about sex. Consenting to sex is like consenting to a cup of tea. Emily Nagoski, who's the author of Come As You Are, had this great analysis of the tea consent on her blog. You know, the basic premise is, I would like to give you tea, would you like tea? And Emily argues that neither the question nor the answer are all that simple. So she wrote a list. On the right side of the list, it says, things I don't want, tea. On the left side, it says, things I want, this person's approval, company, friendship, not to be rude or hurt their feelings, to follow the rules of this culture, to tell my friends I had tea with this person, the sugar and the milk, but not the tea, to find out what this person's teacups are like. That's all you, Emily Nagoski. But what Nagoski does is she puts language to the complexities of consent in a world where some of us don't know what we want. Or we do, but we're too afraid to ask. Or we want sex to do the work of something else, like love and attention and affection and intimacy, just to name a few things. Her list reveals just how messy and complex all of this can be. Maybe what I know about consent I learned in BDSM and sex-positive communities. Sex-positive positive and kinky folks have always talked about consent as a tenet of what we do. Everything stems from consent. I mean, who else do you know who has a catchphrase with consent in it? Kinky people. We've got guidelines about consent, dungeon rules about consent, classes about negotiation and consent. Some might even say we eroticize consent. But where did we learn consent? Not in comprehensive sex education that the majority of us have not gotten. We're all running around giving and getting consent, except when we're not. Going to a munch, having a profile on social media, or being in the scene for 10 years does not mean you understand consent. You can violate someone's consent without meaning to. There are predators in every community, and leather communities are not immune. And we simply have to have a zero-tolerance policy when players violate someone else's consent. There are moments where we have to dwell in the nuance, in the complexity of all. And then there's moments when we absolutely don't have to. Like when survivors speak, we shut up and we listen. I'm a co-founder of Dark Odyssey, and I co-produced that event from 2003 to 2010. And during my time as a producer, I made orientation mandatory for all attendees, regardless of experience or status. Teaching people about consent was part of that orientation, and we made sure that basically everyone knew what the rules and the expectations were. I learned some important lessons. State your mission clearly. Educate attendees about what consent is. Have a clear mechanism for complaints. Listen to those who've been violated. Ask them what they need. We all know there's no such thing as safe space, but there is space where people are aware, people are able to feel that they can speak up about violation, and these concerns are taken seriously by community members, where basically you walk the walk when it matters. This should be the norm at the hundreds of events that happen all around the country that are kinky and sex positive, but it's not. If we as kinky people are going to be the leaders of this, if we're going to brag, let's back it up. Maybe what I know about consent is everything I learned in porn. That is the sound of anti-porn feminists' heads exploding. Yes. True. I actually didn't set out to make consent porn, but that's what I ended up doing. See, there's this long-standing tradition in the adult industry, which is that every performer in the industry has a no list. And it's a list of people, other performers, that they won't work with. And so they give you the list, or their agent gives you the list, and there are no questions asked. There's no negotiation. It is simply you follow the list. When I started casting my first film for Vivid, which was called Chemistry, I wanted to know who was on their yes list. Like, who did they love to work with? Who did they really have chemistry with? Who did they have their eye on? Who did they really, really want? I did this because I wanted performers to have a good time. And I wanted to have them a choice beyond the no about who they worked with. I wanted them to have a choice about what they did with those people. And I wanted to give them agency in the process. It's actually a perfect metaphor for how we think about sex and what we learn about consent. We drill into young people, especially young women's heads, say no when you don't want something. Be firm in your no. Exercise your no. But that is just one piece of the picture, right? There's actually another big piece here, which is yes. The yes list. If performers have yes lists, we all need to have yes lists too. But you know what? It's hard to create and nurture your own yes list when you're constantly being told what should be on it. What supposedly is on other people's yes list. Or that merely having a yes list makes you a pushy, mouthy slut. Let's hear it for pushy, mouthy sluts. I've also always used performer interviews as an element in my films to give them space to speak for themselves, to talk about issues that are important to them, and to create three-dimensional representations of sex workers, which we don't have enough of. When I ventured into BDSM on film with my series Rough Sex, I thought it was absolutely necessary to establish consent, performer limits, have them create and then describe on camera the fantasy scenario. In many times, we film the entire negotiation before the scene happens. This was partly in response to viewers who told me that if I'm watching a porn scene and I'm not quite sure if one or both of the people are into it, it really freaks me out. Viewers of porn want to see consent. Joellen Noddy writes on her blog, The Redhead Bedhead, quote, "The problem is that we think getting on the same page is complicated. Consideration is hard. Caring for each other's needs is inconvenient. Silence is sexy. Talking about this stuff is awkward. Asking ruins the moment. And in the end, this will all end up make everything a lot less fun." Where did we get that idea? Well, porn is always a convenient scapegoat for the troubles with our sexual culture. But have you actually ever seen a Hollywood depiction of sex that was remotely realistic? It's mostly men initiating. There's a lot of looking into each other's eyes. And sparks flying, one simple touch, mind reading, wordless glances, orgasms for everyone, rumpled sheets and beautiful sun coming through the windows in the morning. I mean, who actually has that much natural light in an apartment in the city? What? Very unrealistic. But really, we do hold on to this romantic ideal, and it's entirely problematic on every front. So what can we do as individuals to make meaningful change in our communities? Well, it starts with all of us being willing to be uncomfortable as we look outward and as we look inward. Last weekend, I was at International Ms. Leather, and the 2015, International Ms. Boot Black, Tabitha Fisher, she has a last speech at the end of her reigning year, and she said in her speech, quote, "Change is a sadist. She likes it slow and painful." Yes, she does. Yes, change is difficult, but we still have to do it. We have to hold ourselves and our friends and our lovers and our community members accountable. And to do that, we have to admit that we have, each of us, violated someone's consent in some context somewhere. Charlie Glickman has this great piece he recently wrote about the difference between consent accidents and consent violations. And he says, quote, "If you step on my toes, it hurts whether it was an accident or on purpose." Really true. Just as white people must admit we are racist and benefit from white supremacy, if you are not willing to own up to your own mistakes and accidents and miscommunications, then you're not really ready to dive into the messy, unpredictable, layered, nuanced world of sex. Or for that matter, actually just human interaction. So I'm going to be the first to say that I have violated someone's consent, someone I love. And I had to own it, I had to apologize for it, I had to ask what they needed, and I have to do better. For all of this to happen, we really have to come face to face with our own trauma. Because trauma and violence are cycles. Ashley Shackelford writes on the website For Harriet, quote, "If we continue to use our trauma to avoid accountability, none of us will ever be free to move through our trauma to heal." Ashley Shackelford, Google it. We must acknowledge that we have the power to harm others regardless of our pain and experiences. See, I think it's too easy to say, those are the violators, over there. If you can see it and acknowledge it in yourself, you can see it and acknowledge it in someone else, including someone you love, or you admire, or you respect. Because none of us are on a pedestal, and no one is above it, no matter how famous or skilled you are. So what does a culture of consent look like? I'm going back to Ashley Shackelford for this. She has a really good definition, and I don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Consent culture means we are inherently holding space and agency for all people to exist freely without persecution or infringement upon their autonomy. Consent culture means we are accountable to our communities and to ourselves in upholding inherent body autonomy for everyone. In consent culture, before you respond to someone in person or online who says that they've been violated, you read Yes Means Yes by Jacqueline Freedman and Jessica Valenti. Then you read Asking for It about rape culture by Kate Harding. Then you do some more research on rape culture and you check your own internalized bullshit and you vow not to perpetuate tired old stereotypes or victim blaming before you open your mouth.
Yeah, great.
Consent culture is a space that we create and feed, where we acknowledge that we're all having sex under a system of interconnected oppressions, but our pleasure should not in any way oppress other people. Consent culture is where talking about sex is not a daunting task, where flirting can lead to nothing, or more flirting, or something else, where we look forward to people setting boundaries with us, where discomfort is not a sign of weakness, and where power is always present. Where in some cases we have to toe the line, like in cases where we have serial sexual assault perpetrators, rapists, chronic consent violators. They've got to be called out, they've got to be called in, they've got to be held accountable. We have to toe the line on that. But we also have to allow for ambiguity, for variation, for, dare I say, shades of gray. Okay, but not the awful book. No, I mean the consensual kinds of shades of gray, okay? Not the book. Okay. In consent culture, we have to develop a higher tolerance for being uncomfortable when something we did or we said harmed someone else, and a higher tolerance for confronting that discomfort. We must try to lower our tolerance for people pushing their way past our boundaries. And we have to have basically no tolerance for rape apologists. And the judges in the Gomeshi and the Kesha case, I'm looking at you. You may be in positions of power, but you absolutely got it wrong. Consent culture means not only teaching people about consent, but making it central to comprehensive sex education. Now, for that, of course, we need comprehensive sex education, right? You know, obviously, this was in my feed a lot. Utah recently declared porn as a public health crisis. Abstinence only, and what I call abstinence emphasized sex education is the real public health crisis here. We have to address toxic masculinity and the messages that boys and men get about how to behave sexually. Yes. You can clap for all of these. You have my consent. We need to apply a social justice framework to consent that takes into account all the forces that thwart, know, Or inform, yes.
Say that.
Can you repeat that, please?
I've been asked to repeat that. We need to apply a social justice framework to consent that takes into account all the forces that thwart no and inform yes. We need to keep this fight up on multiple fronts. We need to have more events like this consent summit. And so that's why I just feel so proud, and I applaud NCSF for taking the lead, like it has so many other times, and bringing all of these different people together in the room. Because I, for one, look forward to hearing what all of you have to say. Thank you.